So, welcome to all of you, the viewers of Ambedkar Caravan Media. Today we have a very special scholar on Baba Sahib Ambedkar who has done an extensive research on what we can say the 40s and the 50s of these decades were very important for the Ambedkarite movement, as a lot of things have happened during this period, and there is not a lot of material which was available till recent time, but now with the researcher and the scholars like Chairez, this new information which is coming up throws light on a very dynamic Ambedkarite movement, which has a lot of dimensions that will stun the leaders today. For example, our guest today, Chairez. He says, Jai Bhim, and welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for welcoming
Very
me.
nice to have you. I will just speak a line or two, and then I will just, will request you to go forward with your presentation.
Yeah, of
There
course.
are some there are some aspects which has been confusing, like what put Baba Sahib Ambedkar in the Constituent Assembly. That history is so important that it's often blurred, and people rely on the secondary sources, a reference here and there without having any concrete evidence of that. But Hisas has really got into the depth of the issue and brought up some very invaluable information. The dynamics of between the Congress and Baba Sahib Ambedkar, Gandhi and Baba Sahib Ambedkar. I think this is very important aspect that has that must be communicated to the not only Ambedkar scholars but the people at large. Another important aspect of his research has been, we have been hearing about Gandhi, Churchill, uh, X and Churchill, but we never heard about Churchill-Ambedkar partnership. I would call it partnership because they were in fact working together. And the kind of historical sketch that Hisses has provided us is very interesting. That it's very unique in his scholarship that he's bringing up these very hidden sort of facts about the Ambedkarite history and the movement in general. Also, he's besides being a historian, he's also trying to venture, and he has ventured into anthropological studies. And one of his very important paper on the racial theory, how Baba Sahib Ambedkar rejected the racial theory of caste, based on the very famous, I think the pioneer of anthropology like Bose, and this his student at Columbia University, Golden Weiser, under which Baba Sahib Ambedkar studied. So, and I think Jesus is very unique. He's a very unique Ambedkar scholar. He has really, really, really gone into the archives. Brought some very new information, very new knowledge, and connecting that with the movement. With the kind of papers have been written about the partition, about crisis in the Dalit movement from a particular point of views, which Jesus has been very, very engaged scholar to bring about these facts and arguments. I think it's just that has been a wonderful work. I will stop my introduction here. I just wanted to say that how inspired we are to have this kind of a gamut of knowledge that you are collecting and bring it forth. Pardeep is joining us today. Pardeep will have a few words before we uh, go on to ISIS. Pardeep bhai.
You're mute. You're mute, Pardeep.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I think we can go ahead with the presentation from the Hughes, and then I have few questions for him, and one two question I got from some friends who are really interested into your work, and yeah, we have seen Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's attempts to raise the issue of caste at UN level, and he was trying to get connected with Churchill and raise the issue of untouchability at international level. And I also I think Hughes has worked on during what happened during the partition of India, mostly when people talk is about the Hindu-Muslim binary has been created and the Dalits have been missing from that discussions. So Hughes has brought really insightful information around these aspects. So we will have some questions around these issues, and so yeah, welcome Hughes, and I think I will hand over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. First of all, let me thank you once again for the invitation and for giving me the space and the opportunity to share my research. I guess I really appreciate all of the comments, but like the most important thing to know is that all of this research that I've done is just because Dalit leaders and Dalit intellectuals have written things and put them into paper, and they have preserved quite a lot of the material that it's important for people to have to know about their history. So this is something that I enjoy reading, and when I try to write, I try to make it simple, and I try to tell a story just for everyone to try to understand what was going on. And that's like the objective that I have with that. So I'm just gonna kind of start and share just like a little bit of the research that I've been doing so far since I was a PhD student. And part of it is just to basically trying to understand a few things that when I was reading about Ambedkar, I didn't understand quite well. Um, One of the things is that how did Ambedkar began to work with people like Nehru and Gandhi, right? Like there is this notion that Ambedkar at some point decided to work with Nehru, and he then became like the architect of the Constitution. And that is something from when I was studying Ambedkar, I didn't quite understand how was someone that had been fighting against the Congress in general and had been working with the colonial government suddenly ends up with working with Nehru and Gandhi and so on. So this kind of talk that I'm giving today is gonna kind of try to reflect on how we end up with an image like this, like Ambedkar giving the Constitution to Nehru, and even later on, as we'll see, to Gandhi. So in order for me to understand that image of how Ambedkar has become kind of like the architect of the Constitution, I look into different sources. I look into his politics during the 1940s in particular, and there kind of unfolds a new story about how Ambedkar was kind of in difficult spots politically. He saw that something was coming that was going to be very difficult for Dalit politics, and the way I'm trying to frame this story is by claiming that Ambedkar was in some ways kind of surrounded by difficult choices, right? So let's get on with this. So this is the kind of introduction. This is the points that I want to touch about and the one that I want to talk about. First is untouchability, kind of trying to explain that Ambedkar was very interested in resolving this problem, and the actually big historical event as partition usually touches on this problem of untouchability. So by trying to link these two concepts, partition and untouchability, I try to kind of tell new different stories. The second point that I want to talk about is this thing that a lot of historians have talked about. Even in one of your conversations with Christophe Jaffrelot, he also talks about this, and kind of they explain or they claim that it was Gandhi was the reason behind like Nehru invited Ambedkar to the new government and as the chairman of the Constitution. Even in Javarsh Patel's movie Ambedkar, like that scene that screenshot that I have there in the slide, it's the moment when, in theory, Gandhi tells Nehru that he should invite Ambedkar to become the chairman of the Constitution Committee. So what I'm claiming is that this was not the case. It was actually mostly Nehru's own initiative. And it was and Ambedkar had to accept. It was not out of goodwill, but Ambedkar had to accept this invitation because he was basically running out of options to try it in his quest to protect the constitutional rights of Dalits in India. So the third point that I want to touch upon is that looking at this period, we can see the relationship of Ambedkar with Jinnah and his attempts to internationalize untouchability. As you know, with World War II and all of these historical events going on around the world, a lot of things were changing in India and in general in international politics. So Ambedkar was reacting to these changes. And one of the ways he thought it could be a good way to protect Dalits was to kind of try to reach international organizations, try to reach international leaders in order to make visible or to make the problem of untouchability more visible and to try to kind of gather resources and gather political help to get some rights for Dalits before the British left India. Of course, as you may know, like this was because he thought that if the British left India in this without any sort of political and legal protection for Dalits, this would mean that the oppressors that he considered were oppressing Dalits were going to stay in power, which were like upper caste Hindus and so on. So just to give you a little bit of context about what was going on and how I kind of start to tell this story, we have to look at the roundtable conferences that happened in London from 1929 to 1932. There were 3 meetings, but the most important one for us is the second one when Gandhi goes to represent Congress as the leader, not only of people that supported Congress, but also of every Indian in every corner of the South, the subcontinent. So this was problematic for 2 reasons. First, because one of the big claims that Gandhi had at this particular times is that he was the main representative of Dalits or Harijans, that's the term that he used. And this was problematic for Ambedkar. And why was it problematic for Ambedkar? Because Ambedkar wanted Dalits to be recognized as a political category, as a group of their own that was not under the influence of any other political party. And what Gandhi was trying to do was to say, well, they are different than the rest of Hindus, but actually they are Hindus. They don't need to be a minority. They don't need any protection because the Congress is actually representing them. So this is a big debate, a big fight between Ambedkar and Gandhi during the roundtable conferences. And actually, they can resolve their difference at that particular conference at that time. And what happens is that the prime minister at the time, from the UK, Ramsay MacDonald, says, okay, leave this question to me. I'm going to decide what's going to happen. And he comes with an agreement that is called the Communal Award. And what the Communal Award was doing was basically to give a specific political representation to Dalits. And basically it was kind of claiming and recognizing that Ambedkar's claims had value, that actually Dalits needed some sort of political representation, of a special political representation, which were described as separate electorate. So what were these separate electorates? Basically, it was a sort of double vote. Some political seats were going to be reserved for Dalits politicians only, for Dalit representatives, and the only people that could vote for those seats were Dalits themselves. They could also vote in the general election for any other person that they wanted to, but the main thing is that Dalit representation was only to be decided by Dalits themselves. This was problematic for Gandhi. Gandhi didn't like this decision. He decided that he was not going to accept the communal award. And as a way to reject this, he went onto a fast onto death. And that is like the big famous feud between Ambedkar and Gandhi. What Gandhi said was that that Dalits did not need this type of political representation, and that the only thing that they needed was like that representation of Congress or any kind of type of um, of, of like common representation. So Ambedkar is put into a difficult spot. He's blamed, or people are blaming him that for Gandhi's fast, and he has like the responsibility of saving Gandhi at this time, right? The colonial government kind of decides that they don't want to take any part of this problematic, and they claim that, okay, if you want to do away with the communal award, you can, but you have to accept. So all of the responsibility falls into Ambedkar. He's receiving pressure from everyone in India, and at the end, he decides to sign this Pune Pact. And this is quite important because the Pune Pact is going to change Dalit politics forever, and we can see like the results even today, and it's still kind of an important thing. So what the Pune Pact did basically was that it kind of gave more seats of representation to Dalits, but the main problematic here is that everyone could decide who was going to choose these Dalit representatives. So, for instance, even though there were reserved seats for Dalits, I could put Ambedkar's party, for instance, the Independent Labour Party, could put someone as their candidate, as their representative. But the problem was that Congress could also put a different candidate. And the thing was that the competition was not going to be only between those party leaders and Dalit constituency, but all of the Congress followers could also vote for those seats. So even though all of the Dalits were in a specific area, say Mumbai, were voting for the candidate that Ambedkar put into competition, if everyone else, all of the Congress followers, voted for the Congress candidate, the Congress candidate was the one that was going to be the representative of Dalits, right? Even if he didn't get like a single Dalit vote in that constituency. So that was a big problem for Ambedkar. So Gandhi was opposed to the communal award, and he claimed that if Dalits get this type of separate electorate, they were going to be Dalits in perpetuity. So people were going to we're going to still think of Dalits as untouchables, and that this problem was not going to go away. Ambedkar, on the other hand, would claim like, well, we actually need political power to make people respect us, because if we don't have any political power, then we're not going. It doesn't matter if I consider myself untouchable or not. It's actually what other people see and the way the other people look at me. So the Pune Pact then is accepted. We have a big constitutional change that comes in 1935, named as the Government of India Act, and Ambedkar creates the Independent Labour Party. And why is this important? This is important because these were the 1930s, were the radical change or the radical years of Ambedkar's politics. He kind of starts thinking that if I don't have separate electorates for Dalits, I need to broaden my base of politics. So he tries to make untouchability a labor issue, and he tries to start to forge links with other movements, particularly land movements, and the anti-quota system, and try to unionize Dalits with larger unions throughout Bombay. And all of these are very anti-Congress. So a big election was coming, and actually this kind of strategy, this new strategy that Ambedkar had about labor was in some ways very, very successful. These were the best election results that Ambedkar has as a politician. But mind you, these were mostly uh, based in what we know today as Maharashtra. It was a regional kind of result. But this was important for Ambedkar because he thought like, okay, we actually have a political movement that could function, that could be successful, and then he was gonna try to bring that success into national politics. So this is an interesting thing because now it's kind of hard to imagine that Ambedkar was not as relevant at this particular time in Indian politics, but in the 1930s he was kind of beginning to grow as a really important politician. He was not there yet. There were other Dalit politicians that were around and that kind of competed for the British and the Congress attention. In particular, M.C. Raja was a really important figure at this particular time, but Ambedkar, because of his education, because of his political strategies, because of his writings, he was gaining terrain against other Dalit politicians. So when Ambedkar was kind of trying to deal with these new strategies of labor politics, he started to criticize Congress. He announced that he was going to leave Hinduism, and he was kind of setting up his main claims that actually, if the British left India, the main problem was that the main oppressors of Dalits are going to stay in power. So what he wanted to do was to gain the most political rights that he could get, and this meant competing at a national level against Congress. So if you look, for instance, in what Congress and Gandhi have done to the Untouchables, published in 1946, you'll see kind of like these ideas that I'm talking about and all of these processes that Ambedkar is kind of trying to fight against. So in some ways, he knew that this new political system that was set up by the Pune Pact was going to be detrimental for Dalit politics. So what happens then? In order to bring this new politics into a national level, Ambedkar starts making connections with the other big Congress opposition. And this was mainly the Muslim League and Jinnah, in particular because Jinnah was in the same area as Ambedkar. So even though there were different political Muslim parties throughout India, particularly in northern India and in Bengal, Ambedkar is from the same area as Jinnah, and they are kind of usually in contact about what the different steps are going to happen. Of course, in this picture, we also see Periyar. So we see that a larger connection of politics are in India at this particular time. This is the same time when World War II is starting to emerge. So this picture is about the Day of Deliverance, in which everyone in this picture is kind of celebrating that the Congress is leaving their political seats because they are against India being part of World War II, right? So Ambedkar, Periyar, and Jinnah kind of understand this as a political opportunity for them to gain their own claims to power. So what is interesting about these connections between Dalits and Muslim politics is that they've been there for a long time. For instance, if you think of 1857, there's a claim that there were connections between Dalits and Muslims. There's also like Jinnah and Ambedkar's political conversation. But even when people were starting to imagine how Pakistan could look like, they left a space for what they conceive as Achutistan, which would kind of be a term for Dalits to have their own space in India after if there was some sort of partition. So what is interesting then is that Muslims and Dalits are aware of their own political existence. They are actually in conversation. But when we tend to think about the history of Indian nationalism or the history of partition, we only think about Hindus and Muslims and sometimes Sikhs, but Dalits are usually erased from this narrative. But the main thing is actually that they were present, they were having conversations, and they knew that any political decision was going to have consequences for the other groups that were in India at this particular time. How do we know this as well? Basically, because India wrote 2 different books about Pakistan and the consequences that partition could have for India. What is interesting is that Ambedkar changes his mind when he is writing about this. For instance, first he wrote this report that was called Thoughts on Pakistan when he was the leader of the Independent Labour Party, and he was in support of the partition of India. He claimed that India, Hindus and Muslims were basically different. This is what we know as the two-nation theory, and that these differences were never going to be erased, and therefore there needed to be some type of partition and some type of division for India. The rationale behind this was that if Muslims were not in India, Dalits could take their place in the political arena. So in some ways, if Muslims left India at this particular time, that was his rationale, Dalits could take their place and they could become like the second force of Indian politics. But this changed in a few years later because Ambedkar realized that if there was a partition and Muslims were not there, and if the colonial government was not there as well, then actually Dalits could be in quite a lot of trouble because Dalits were not going to have 2 of their best and strongest political allies, right? So in Pakistan or the partition of India, he changes the narrative and is trying to convince Jinnah not to leave Pakistan and trying to claim that there could be 3 different political forces, one led by Congress, one led by the Muslim League, and one led by himself and Dalits. And if they had like these 3 different political forces, you actually can erase this notion of majority, of majoritarian politics, because everyone was going to have to make deals with at least one other political party or one other political force, and therefore the interests of everyone were going to be protected. So that's like the big change. And now I'm going to try to explain why these changes came about. So what changed? So what's interesting that changed is that Jinnah changes his discourse quite a bit. Also, international politics are changing quite a bit. The Christ missions comes to India during World War II, and they actually seem that they're not really interested in keeping India anymore. They're actually also trying to ensure that Congress works with the colonial government in support of the war efforts. So Ambedkar is going to see that the interest that the colonial government had for Dalits is going to start to dissipate, or it's going to start to run away, or disappear. So In 1942, we see Ambedkar is trying to make a big change in his politics. He's going to try to bring this notion of Dalits at a national level. This is interesting in some ways. It might be a bit controversial, but this is something that I do think happened. That at this particular time, there were a lot of like Dalit castes throughout India, as there are now, but there wasn't a shared identity that everyone was in this boat together. Regional regional identities were more important because if you and caste identities were also more important than this notion that Dalits were a single political group. If you think about it at this particular time, any caste, and this is not only about Dalits, any caste didn't, if they were in a different region, they didn't think of themselves as a single unit, as a single political unit, because they didn't share a language, they didn't share a profession, they didn't share a geographical territory, they didn't have a lot in common. This is something that Ambedkar's discourse is trying to build. He's trying to forge some unity that now we know as a Dalit kind of political group or as a Dalit identity. But before this time, there were a lot of different interests going around that were kind of detrimental for Ambedkar's politics, right? So in 1942, Ambedkar realizes that actually the Pune Pact was quite bad, and he wants his demands again for separate electorates. He wants to go back to the communal award. He wants to set up separate villages in which Dalit political representation is exclusive for them. And he's actually celebrating the day of the liberty and Periyar and so on. So the main problem for him was that at the national, there are some elections, and he has a terrible result in 1945 and 1946. So even Ambedkar did not win his own political contest, and the results of the Pune Pact are made evident to him. He realizes that he is not capable to compete with a political party that is so big and it's like an well-oiled machine as the Congress. So thanks to J.N. Mandal in Bengal, he's able to be elected to the Constituent Assembly in Bengal. And later on, partition is going to happen. And later on, he doesn't join Congress, but he becomes part of the cabinet, right? So how did this happen? So here we have to look into the writings about Pakistan. So in 1940, he's claiming that Pakistan should exist, that the differences are too big to be erased, and this is going to change. This type of vision is going to change in a few years, and all of these changes are going to happen quite dramatically because Ambedkar is actually becoming aware that all of his political allies are actually giving or turning their back against him. And this is something that he kind of brings up to Jinnah several times. And he claims like, well, you want our support. You want the support of the scheduled caste whenever it's convenient to you. But you don't, when we need to have like your support, when we need like for you to claim that you're actually not a nation, when you're actually not a majority, and you're actually are a minority that can support other minorities, you don't actually you're not there for us. So all of this frustration with Jinnah makes Ambedkar look into other places for support. And this is like the international arena. This is where he's trying to internationalize the problem of untouchability. This is, as I mentioned, is a realization that the Pune Pact is quite problematic and that actually the reservation of seats that Gandhi envisioned are quite detrimental for him and for Dalits themselves. So all of these are just kind of illustration of the things that I've been talking about. This is where he's talking about separate settlements and why they are important, and it's a way to prevent Dalits being exploited by upper caste people. So let's move into the internationalization of untouchability. And as someone mentioned on Twitter, we know that Ambedkar was being increasingly frustrated for different reasons. One was because Jinnah did not see Muslims as a minority anymore. They were asking for political parity, which meant that if India was to stay together, Muslims, or at least Jinnah, wanted to have 50% of all political representation, and the other 50% was meant to Congress or Hindus in general, right? So why was this parity, this notion of parity important? Because it meant that other minorities, such as Christians, Buddhists, Sikhs, or Dalits, they wouldn't have any sort of political representation or a special representation. So Ambedkar is really frustrated about this, and he realizes that Congress is not interested in making a deal with him. The Muslim League is not interested in making a deal with him. The colonial government is not interested in keeping their alliances with him, because they are trying to get out of the war. They're trying to leave India, and they are actually trying to have good terms with both Muslims and Hindus. And he kind of realizes that he's on his own. He's frustrated, he's lonely, and he decides like the best way to get some type of attention, get some type of support, is to look beyond India, to look into to the international arena. So what does he do? First, he decides to start writing to people. He announces that he is going to have this new approach to Dalit politics, and that's why he writes to W.E.B. Du Bois in the United States. And this was a prominent African-American leader, and he says, like, he writes to Du Bois and asks him for any type of suggestion, advice about what he has done in the shape of supporting African-American rights through the United Nations. They have an exchange of communication, and this is something that a lot of people know, and that is something that is there, and that is one of the letters. But Ambedkar also announces, and this is something that takes people by surprise in India, he announces that he's going to go to the UN and kind of appeal to the world that people and Dalits, like 60 million people of Dalits, are being left on their own with their oppressors, right? So this raises a lot of eyebrows both in India and Britain. It even has the attention of people that are quite problematic, like Jan Smuts, and Jan Smuts had like this issue with India at that particular time, but everyone is kind of receiving attention or are kind of perceiving that Ambedkar is onto something. The United Kingdom government replies to this and is trying to prepare for Ambedkar's possible delegation to the UN, and they were going to claim in a way which was kind of shifting their politics of 20-something years, that they were going to claim, if Ambedkar went to the UN, that actually Ambedkar was not the only representative of Dalits, that he was not the most important representative of Dalits, and actually he did. They were going to claim that Ambedkar did pretty bad in the elections, and it was someone like Gandhi who was like the true leader of Dalits. So that was one thing. The other thing that Ambedkar did was to write to Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, and this connection is somewhat problematic, but it's interested of all the possibilities that Ambedkar was willing to explore to get some rights for Dalits themselves. And why was this important? Of course, Churchill was pro-empire. He wanted to keep the empire in India. But the reason that Churchill, at this particular time, he had his own agenda. Of course, he had like his own imperialist ideas and dreams. But he would claim that actually the empire was there in India to protect people that didn't have any political power, and leaving India at this particular time was going to leave Ambedkar and his followers on their own, and that this was quite problematic. So what's interesting is that Ambedkar not only wrote to Gandhi, he actually went to the UK and visited, he not only wrote to Churchill, he actually went to the UK, and Churchill invited him to his house or to his home in Kent. And this received quite a lot of attention. And this is, for instance, after Ambedkar goes to visit Winston Churchill. This is one of the letters where Ambedkar thanks Churchill for receiving him. He also visited Parliament, and he talked to British representatives. But the problem was that the international environment and the international political arena was not, at this particular time, was not interested in defending the rights of minorities. And why were they not interested in defending the rights of minorities? Mainly because this notion of rights of minorities have been used by Nazis mainly to start a war, but also because the flavor of the day in international politics was self-determination. So all of the left-wing politicians in the UK were kind of preaching, and they were talking about self-determination in India, and the people that were the most recognizable for these movements of independence and self-determination were Gandhi and Nehru. So the Fabian Society, the British left politicians, they saw Ambedkar as someone that was actually preaching for something that was not fashionable anymore, even though he was trying to protect his community. But they were more willing to associate themselves with someone like Gandhi and Nehru because they had like the right buzzword, which was independent and self-determination. And this is something that is going to continue after the 40s, and we see like these movements of decolonization. It's not about minorities, it's about self-determination, it's about independence. So Ambedkar is kind of trying to reach, trying to gain support from people that are actually out of power, like Churchill, or that they do not have a lot, they are recognizable like Du Bois, but they do not have a lot of power. And he's kind of fighting at the wrong time for the wrong cause in the eyes of the international arena, right? So after all of this, Ambedkar is in trouble. He has to decide what to do next. And his options are kind of limited to try to get some sort of representation, and he's kind of in a corner. So he is gonna try to reach some sort of deal with the people he has been fighting all along, right? This is not only about him, but also people like Sardar Patel, or people like Nehru himself, or Rajendra Prasad, actually realize that Ambedkar is an important person. And if they wanted to keep India as a strong, united country, they were going to need to do two things. One was to get rid of the Muslim League, which was something that was going to happen through partition. And the other was to bring people, other opposition leaders like Ambedkar into their fold, right? So Ambedkar then realizes that this is quite problematic. This is what he calls, it is a very deep game realizing that there is no escape from giving the untouchables some safeguards, and that the Congress wants to find out some ways in which it can make them of no effect. So he realizes that he's in a difficult spot, but he is going to need to achieve something, or he's going to have to reach a deal with Nehru. And after a few years, after a few months, like, Patel is the one that gets in touch with Ambedkar and invites him into government. So it's not Gandhi. And we know that it's not Gandhi for several reasons. First, because Patel is the one that is writing to Nehru about how important it is to include Ambedkar in the new cabinet, but also because Ambedkar and Gandhi have been on writing against each other in 1946 and 1947. And all of these times, they are writing against each other. First, we have, of course, the book that Ambedkar wrote, what Congress and Gandhi have done to the untouchables, published in 1945 and reprinted in 1946. And then we have, these are not written by Gandhi, but we have the letters where Gandhi instruct Rajaji, and he instruct, I'm forgetting the name of the second author now, about publishing these two books. One is Ambedkar's Attack, where Ambedkar is kind of, when they're trying to claim that Ambedkar's arguments against Gandhi are quite bad, and Rajaji, who is trying to show why Ambedkar is not the actual leader of Dalits, and it's actually Gandhi that is the actual leaders of Dalits. Of course, all of this, these two books where Gandhi writes to these two people to write these books against Ambedkar. So Gandhi was not at all interested in having Ambedkar as part of the new government. And then we have Nehru's invitation, which gives us a little bit of explanation about why Ambedkar was incorporated into the new government. So this is a letter in which Nehru is actually kind of scolding Ambedkar for a few comments that Ambedkar did at a conference in which he was being critical of Nehru and Congress. And this is in 1948. So what is interesting is actually that Nehru claims, like, look, man, I invited you to this government because it would be out of interest for me. This because it meant, like, you were going to work with us, we were going to work together, but actually being part of this government means that you need to have good faith and you need to kind of be in our side rather than criticizing us. So in some ways, the invitation to give Ambedkar, the invitation to Ambedkar from Nehru was in some ways to control his criticism against Congress, right? It's here, for instance, in the second paragraph it says, but inevitably, or working together in a cabinet means a certain goodwill towards the Congress, or at least an avoidance of anything that might be construed as an attack of the Congress. So we see that Ambedkar was in a difficult situation, and he thought that, well, it's better to be in the government, it's better to be in the Constituent Assembly than not be part of it. And Nehru and Congress had their own interest in mind, and in a way was to say, like, well, he is a big leader. They are recognizing his leadership. They are recognizing his legal knowledge, his political knowledge. And they are saying, well, but it's better to have him on our side, under our kind of observation, and we can in some ways control the criticism that is coming from Ambedkar's behalf. So here we have then kind of what I explained already, this notion of divide and rule, in which actually Congress, by dividing, I mean, they're not responsible for the partition of India, but they are bringing people, and they are actually they are ruling themselves after the division has taken place. So this is how we kind of understand and how we kind of come back from are two images at the beginning of my presentation, in which we start to understand why Ambedkar now is represented in a way as the one of the as a father of the nation, but also as someone that is there, that even though he's not represented as a Hindu, he's kind of putting the nation first rather than his own personal politics. We know, of course, that that stint in which Ambedkar worked for Congress was quite short. We know that after writing the Hindu Code Bill, he was he resigned because Nehru and Congress did not want to make the changes that Ambedkar was suggesting. But we still remember him as the chairman of the Constitution, or as the father of the Constitution. And that is something that, of course, needs to be celebrated. But this is only a short period in Ambedkar's life, right? And if we don't kind of question those stories, we don't get to see, for instance, how he was being represented during the writing of the Hindu Code. If you can see here, it says Hindu society, and it's actually Hindu societies kind of protesting against Ambedkar writing the Hindu Code. But if we are not aware of this type of problems, if we are not aware of the history of how Ambedkar ended up working with people like Nehru, then it's problematic, because the appropriation by right-wing parties is possible. Then the appropriation of Ambedkar only as the father of the Constitution and not as a radical opposition leader is erased. And then people start doing all this appropriation. They start doing all these rituals, as we see in this picture, that go against Ambedkar's values, against Ambedkar's own political views. So I'm gonna leave it at that.
Jesus, that's very informed presentation, I would say, that you could bring about such complex history for the audiences. Pradeep, you want to say something?
Yeah, that was great. Actually, really, I learned a lot also. Actually, and I have some questions. If you don't mind, like, shall I start, or Mangesh bhai, you would like to start?
Please go on. Put up some questions.
Yeah, we didn't have time in the beginning to kind of ask users about, like, coming from Mexico, how did you get interested into these caste issues about Ambedkar and untouchability? What was like driving force behind, and what led you to this path? Actually, like, what interested you in this thing?
So when it's kind of a long answer, but I'll try to keep it short. So I was studying a master's about Indian history, and my initial thought was to kind of write about Gandhi and the Satyagraha movements and stuff and so on, because I was interested kind of on how ideas were important for politicians. But when I started to read about Gandhi, I came across Ambedkar, and I didn't understand what the criticism was about that Ambedkar was coming from, because coming from Mexico, if you learn about India, anything about India, is that Gandhi is the Mahatma, right? It's like he's the important person. He's like the most visible Indian in I guess in any other country in the world. So when I started to read about Ambedkar, I kind of tried to understand where he was coming from, and I didn't understand. So I started to read a little bit more, and I started to read a little bit more, and started to read a little bit more, and I realized okay, what he's saying actually makes sense. I started to learn a little bit more about Gandhi, and he also seemed quite problematic. And then in practical terms, I realized like everyone had written about Gandhi, and I didn't know at that particular time a lot of people that had written about Ambedkar. So I thought that was the most interesting kind of bit of I mean, that was kind of an opportunity to write about someone that was not very well known in Mexico or in other parts of the world. So I was also very interested in how he was kind of trying to criticize the caste system, to criticize everything that he came about that thought was oppressive. So that was also an inspiration. So that's kind of basically how I I I ended up writing about him. And as I mentioned in a previous conversation, also because I had like people like Ellen or Celia sending me her book. I had people kind of that were being very supportive about my research, and that's how I ended up kind of writing about these things.
Yeah, that's great. That's nice to know, actually. Yeah, and yeah, let me come back to one of the points you were mentioning and trying to make an argument that it wasn't the Gandhi that led to Ambedkar's inclusion into the Nehru government, but other Patel, and they played an important role. So, and you kind of disagree with the Christoph Law as well, that yeah, in the Christoph Law, he made the argument that it was Gandhi's instinct. He led Ambedkar's inclusion into the Nehru government. So, do you think that if Ambedkar hadn't joined the Nehru government, would it like his image as a critic of Congress and Gandhi would have been stronger than it is at present? Because I think in one of your article, in the research paper, you also mentioned that Congress also used this as an opportunity to kind of neutralize that image from the Ambedkar side, like he was too much strong critic of Congress and Gandhi. So they also wanted to kind of neutralize that little bit, and so that's why they also wanted him be in. Also, you mentioned some of these Nehru's letter mentioning that you are in the government, you should be kind of collaborating with us, not criticizing and all. So do you think that if that Ambedkar hadn't joined that Congress, his image at present would have been stronger against the against Congress, and would it had helped also? That's the second question. Would it had helped Dalit at present?
It's hard to know. It's hard to know because it's something that it didn't happen. I think it was. I mean, I think it helped in a way in which now we have Ambedkar as we recognize Ambedkar in a powerful position, and which is like as the chairman of the committee or as the father of the constitution, right? That is quite important, and it's something that can be I mean that is something that one cannot overlook. Whether because if he was not there, it actually we might have lost Ambedkar in different things. But if you think about it, in terms of in the historiography or like the histories that have been written from the 1950s, so after Ambedkar's death, from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, if you look into any history book, Ambedkar is like it's hardly even there. He's like he's given like one or two lines, just claiming like he was an important person, and it's not only after someone like Kanshi Ram and Mayavati kind of like bring Ambedkar into play again, that he starts to gain recognition, like in terms I'm only talking about historical writing. So it's interesting that now we can use it in both ways. We can say that he was there and he was important in the construction of independent India. But I think from the 50s to the 60s, when Nehru was alive, actually, it was quite helpful to have him as part of the Congress, because his legacy kind of disappeared for a few years, right? Even if you think of after the conversion of like the Buddhist conversion, we don't even get like the recognition that Buddhists can get like reservations and all of these things, right? So I do think like I do think like it would have changed the legacy, but it's of Ambedkar if he didn't join Congress. But it's difficult to know whether it would have been better or worse, because it's just like yeah, it's just like, yeah, we cannot make that judgment or that assessment really.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Yeah, it's kind of a hypothetical question, and so I just wanted to know like how it would have affected the Dalit community, and maybe like I understand that that's a pure hypothetical question. Also, you mentioned about the this special place that was being. You showed that map of India where the Ashutistan or Dalistan has been kind of put separate. And Ambedkar also mentioned in his writings, he's talking about the separate villages and separate settlements for the untouchables. So why do you think that demand or that kind of approach didn't gain the prominence? And was he? I could imagine that he was very busy man, and he was doing a lot of stuff. But still, like at present, if you see like even Congress or BJP and all these politicians at present as well, like they start kind of raising these issues, and there is or especially like Dalit MP member of parliament among these parties, that we should go for the Dalistan or Ashutistan. So why didn't this demand could get the prominence?
Well, because I mean, from my own perspective, it was very different from this notion of Pakistan. If you think of Pakistan, even though it was also quite problematic, but if you think of Pakistan, you could find Muslims in specific pockets of India, right? You find them in the Punjab, you find them in and they were kind of concentrated there. So they were kind of that on that argument, they have a specific place where they could claim they were a majority, and that area could be a specific territory for them. But when it came to Dalits in India, they are spread across the country. There's no specific pocket where they can be found. Rather, they are minorities everywhere. So just to choose a single place to bring them all was kind of impossible, I guess. So they didn't have like the same type of claim that Muslims have in that respect. Then there was also like the issue of what would bring Dalits together, right? So in terms of Muslims, they have Islam as a binding element, right? Whether they speak Urdu or they speak Bengali was not relevant, because the main characteristic was that they were Muslims. In terms of Dalits, of course, now Ambedkar was claiming at this particular time that he was not a Hindu anymore, but a lot of Dalits identify as Hindu anyway. So they didn't have like that strong bond that people could identify as 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 something that could determine their establishment in a specific geographical territory. So, I mean, yeah, it's hard to know like why you didn't take force this type of demand, but you can see why it could be easily dismissed from politicians.
I would like Mangesh Bhai to jump in now. Like I have one, two more questions, but I think Yusuf might have to leave soon. So Mangesh Bhai, uh,
Yeah,
join.
Jesus bhai, I have two things to ask you. One is, this 1946 elections were very crucial.
Mm-hmm.
The elections of 1946 were very crucial, and that time Baba Saheb Ambedkar was, just about, he has become very prominent in terms of his policy interventions in employment, in housing, and in a way, like in 4 years, he was turning the governance towards the government for the common man. And I think that has a lot of bearing in 1946 elections. uh, the Congress was claiming that the whole India is after them, like following them. But Baba Saheb Ambedkar says that if the entire India is behind them, why during the campaigning the Congress ministers are flying all over the places, putting so much of money
Yeah.
to get elected if they have the entire India behind them? And then he goes on to prove also that the Dalits had been backing him all the way through the results of the
Yeah.
primary election. Now my question is, this uneven level playing field, because even that time it was not a level playing field, as you have argued in this countering claims by Shekhar Bandopadhyay in his article Crisis,
Mm-hmm.
that so it's not about the kind of the Dalits traditionally have had no access to the means of for fighting back. And Baba Saheb Ambedkar was creating those means, and he was bringing together, like 1946 all in SCF meeting in Bombay, which brought 75,000 people, and they came from all over the places, and the identity as a scheduled caste was
Mm-hmm.
being was being forced, like in Punjab, everywhere. So what I'm saying is,
Mm-hmm.
the as a historian now, when we look back at the 46 election in 1946 and today, like 2019, as personally I don't see much change in that, because in the political machinery that is in the hands of uh, the political dominant forces, and the kind of Dalit parties today we have, I think there is a huge difference between the kind of resources that they bring during the electioneering. So I just wanted to ask you, like, this 46 and 2019, there are two points in the history. Do you see any changes in that, the scenario in 1946, and the same thing in 2019? As a historian, where do you see any changes?
So I think the big change is that with this notion of, for instance, like Bahujan politics, or the examples of UP, where you had people like Kanchiram, but also Mayavati. The big change is that they follow a different political strategy in terms of something that Ambedkar was not able to do. One was that Ambedkar was not a very good kind of political. I mean, he was not that he wasn't very good, but he didn't have the resources to set up like these kind of political missions where you see people going to villages and uh, talking about Ambedkar, uh, setting up like this type of teaching songs about Dalit history, about Dalit movement, putting up plays about, I mean, like theater, right? Like theater plays about Ambedkar and the importance of voting and the importance of constitutional rights. There is a big change in the type of organization that Dalits themselves have created and have put into place, right? And in terms of politics, I think there are a few political parties that have been successful in creating alliances, particularly those led by Majavati, that have been able to create, even though they are like very problematic alliances, she has been able to to acquire power for a significant amount of time, right? And I think that's and other political parties recognize that that is a source of power. I think that's the change that you can say, but of course the field is still uneven. Of course, once someone gets into power, they tend to forget about people. Uh, so that's always there. But there is that particular change that now Dalits are recognized as a political force in specific places, and that they are able to get into power at times, which is something that it didn't happen, right? But yeah, I think like the most interesting thing for me is the way Dalit literature has created a space to spread the message, to spread the word about Ambedkar and about the importance of learning about Dalit history and so on. I think that's a big change. Ambedkar didn't have that support. It was just a few leaders that were kind of trying to spread the word, trying to I mean, he also had like this thing, right? Like Ambedkar could write something, people were able to read it. So he didn't have like that reach. He didn't have media to make a post and that thousands of people were going to read it, to react to it, to kind of think about that. He was kind of the Dalit movement at that particular time were a couple of educated Dalit leaders, and the only way they could gather support was to actually go and talk to the people, which with very limited resources. So that is a big difference.
This might be a little bit controversial question, but let's go into it. Let's get into it. There is this paper that you wrote on the kind of the evolution of the anthropological thoughts of Baba Saheb Ambedkar, going back to the people like Bose and Golden Weiser, and then later on like Ruth and even Gids to some extent, when they were denying this kind of the racial theories of the humanities and the human races. Can you tell a little bit on, like in a nutshell, what do you understand by the refutal of the racial theories by Baba Saheb Ambedkar, drawing on from this tradition, starting from the so-called founder, one of the founders of anthropology, Boas.
Yeah.
So
let
I
me
lost.
sorry, let me
Yeah.
I had the same question actually. I think I let me add also what Mangesh already said. Yeah, you wrote one paper that's really controversial. I was coming to that actually. You mentioned the name of MC Raja and Perrier, who were much more into Aryan invasion theories and all that, dominance of Aryan and non-Aryans. And similarly, I think in one of the papers you mentioned about the Jyotiba Phule as well, because he tried to distinguish between the Shudra, Ati Shudra, and outsiders. And so yeah. Tell us a little bit about like his influence, like how Ambedkar put his arguments against these things, and also a little bit about the influence that his professors had from the Columbia University while he was studying there. So yeah.
So like, I mean, I will reply. I just want to know, like, it's controversial because I'm placing Ambedkar like kind of in a different stand as MC Raya and all this and Fule and all these people? Is that is it that's why it's controversial?
Yeah, because in southern, like in Tamil Nadu, if you would go, and maybe in Maharashtra, those who believe in Fule's ideology, and especially like Bamse affair as well. Like if you know about the Bamsef, which was like previous to BSP.
Yeah.
So they also propagate these ideas that Aryans came from outside and they defeated the original inhabitants, and so they became this is like kind of a bit controversial, and so tell us about your ideas.
No, definitely. I don't think, I mean, I understand why it might be controversial, or why it's kind of like different than other things that I and why like other people have established those connections, right? But if you think in terms of the politics when Ambedkar was writing, we have to understand a few things. One is that at that particular time, not everyone was able to vote, right? If you wanted to vote, a few things needed to happen. First was that you needed to have some land, and a second one was that you needed to be educated. That was like the only way you could access education. However, once the electoral reform began, Ambedkar realized something, and this is something that it's in history, that in anthropological views of the time, of the 1910s, 1920s, but going all the way back to the 19th century, this notion of racial superiority is brewing, right? So in India, one of the means for having colonialism was that the British were racially superior than any other Indian. The British colonizers were teaching Indians how to rule themselves, right? And they decided that they were going to introduce voting gradually, and people were going to start to know about politics, and they were going to eventually rule themselves. But along with this notion, there came these ideas, racial ideas, were coming as well. And one of the ways in which people were being denied voting rights was this notion that they were racially inferior. So you had all of these Adivasi groups that were being denied rights because they were tribes, they were nomad, and they didn't know what voting or political power was. Now, Ambedkar was aware of these theories, as I wrote in the article, and Dalits were right in the middle of that category. People would claim that they were actually racially inferior than Hindus because they were coming from, they had been conquered. There was a discussion of whether they understand political power at all, or whether they deserve to gain any political power. So if you, at that particular time, if you accept this theory of Aryans coming from the north and Dravidians being part of the south, in some ways you were acting Dalits, in terms for Ambedkar, were racially inferior, and as Adivasis, they could be denied votes. They could be denied electoral rights. So what he's trying to say is that race is actually not an important factor. And that factor would allow him to claim political rights, would allow him to claim that, you know, we're not racially inferior. This is actually a constructed category. It's actually a constructive narrative in history. So from my own perspective, that it is what he's trying to do. It's by making himself different than other people, is just a way of saying, it's not a way of kind of rejecting political alliances with people from the South, but it's actually saying we are not inferior than any other people in India. And that's what he's saying, according to your own kind of racial theories, according to to experiments that are looking into the questions of race, there is no difference between a Brahmin in Punjab and a Dalit in Punjab. There is no difference between a Brahmin in Tamil Nadu and a Dalit in Tamil Nadu. So there might be genetic difference between the people in the north and the people in the south, but the main difference is not related to caste or related to untouchability. And that's what I was trying to say in that piece.
I think we already have had a good discussion. Pardeep, you want to ask something to brother Rises?
No, I have one question, but before that, I want to say that this last answer was really good, and if viewers are really interested into reading that, this article I found very interesting actually, because in that he uses try to put the cultural differences between these communities. That was the kind of laying this foundation, and the untouchability came into picture as a fight. As Ambedkar says, it was a history of India is nothing but the fight between Buddhism and Brahmanism. So that kind of things, if viewers are interested in that, that paper was really really good. And last thing that I want to ask is, like, we've been talking about this untouchability, politics, and we went through all different issues. And I think there was one more that is very interesting paper that you have written is on special features of the untouchability, where you try to distinguish between the how untouchability practices in villages and the cities have led to different kind of nationalism that has led. So here I want to ask is, like, tell us a bit more about, like, how Dr. Ambedkar viewed this as like how nationalism in villages is working, and how nationalism in cities work. Because this question I'm asking, because at present, like, right wing Hindu government is in power, so uh, they try to, like, go for this nationalism, and they try to project Ambedkar like that quote you might have heard, like, I am Indian first and Indian lastly. So they go after that, and they push that in the throats of common public. And so I want to know that how this since Ambedkar's time, this from that those views that Ambedkar had, that in the villages there is a different kind of nationalism, and on the city level there is a different type of nationalism, and then how it has changed and evolved during all these years. And so how these right-wing politicians are using at present. So yeah, talk a little bit about those things. That would be interesting, I think.
So the idea about that, like the special features of untouchability, was, I guess, something that Ambedkar kind of encountered at different stages of his political career. And it was due mainly because all of his during his political career, he was based in a city, right? So even when he writes about his own experiences with untouchability, all of them happen like in villages, right? Like, it is in the village where he kind of is aware of his untouchability. So he writes about it in different ways. One way is that the city kind of allows people to have certain type of anonymity, right? So if I'm in India, if I'm in Delhi, Mumbai, like, right, people might see you and they might assume what caste you are. I mean, they might make assumptions about your caste. They might make assumptions about your about your um, about your class and stuff. They might make different assumptions, but unless they ask you directly, it's hard to know. Like a lot of people then decide if you need to go on the metro, if you need to go on an auto. You kind of don't say anything. You don't make assumptions, because if you were to be respecting caste rules, it would be impossible to live in a city all of the time, right? If you move, like if you don't have a car or anything, right? So Ambedkar knew like there was like that sense of protection in the city of anonymity, where he felt a little bit more free than in the village. And this is from his own experiences. In the village, he would say like, well, if it's a small village, first of all, people know who I am, like they know where they live, they know what I do, they know, they actually can make me dress in a certain way, they can make me act in a certain way. Why? Because usually the people he was writing about were landless peasants, and they depended on on Batan or like the Koti system to get food and to get work and to all sort of things, right? So there wasn't that anonymity. People in the village were united because they were less, and they could enforce certain caste practices that were harmful for Dalits. So that was one thing. And why was Ambedkar writing about this? He was writing about it because Gandhi and Nehru were discovering India, and they would claim like what make India different from Britain was their villages, and they saw these villages as an ideal place, as an utopia, that it was where the Indian spirit, or the spirit of all India, was located. And Ambedkar was reacting against that, to say like, actually the villages are quite oppressive and they are quite problematic, right? The second thing is that because Ambedkar was located in a city, he realized that if there was a place where Dalits themselves could kind of put away these Jati identities as Chamar or Mahar, and so on, it could be in the city. They could, for instance, in the 1930s, if these groups came together as a union or as a political movement, then getting rid of these identities that are alive in the village could actually be better for them as a political movement. So that was another reason in which he would claim like these divisions of caste that are present in the village can actually disappear in the city, because you're not following your ancestral profession. You're rather looking for a new profession. You are working in a mill, and you're not doing what, and you're not like you are not a peasant anymore, or you're not any other profession that you may think about, right? So that was like the other thing. So for him, those were like the features of untouchability. So if you have the spatial features of untouchability, so if you have a large place, then untouchability becomes more difficult to enforce, because caste is not as visible. It's not as visible. You're not wearing like this pitoon. You're not. I mean, this is what Ambedkar was writing about, right? Not. You don't have to take off your sandals when you go through a village, because nobody knows you. You're just walking on the street, and that was his own vision of that. We know, of course, that in the cities, like caste is still practiced, and like some forms and some caste practices are actually quite damaging as well. But in his own mind, that was kind of, I mean, or at least that's the way I interpret his ideas, that the city offers something that the village could not. So even when the Mahat Satyagraha was going on, the people that were kind of supporting this these satyagrahas were not people from the place. They were people that were coming from the city to kind of to to fight to make I mean to protest against these practices.
Yeah.
Pardeep?
No, I could continue to talk if you want me forever. But this topic is really interesting for me because his work on like different issues, like these special aspects of untouchability, this class difference, this color difference, and bringing attention of the world toward the untouchability. These all issues are really interesting for me, and I could continue, but I think we should stop here. And if you have any other comments or question, that yeah, go ahead.
Actually, the kind of work Hisas has taken up and the kind of knowledge he's producing, historical, anthropological, is very interesting. And we are looking forward towards the publication of your thesis very much. And because I think there are a lot of things which are there that people need to know. The Churchill Ambedkar communications. I think there is a straw where these communications are stored, and it will be interesting to see more on this interaction, because as you said that now the world is beginning to see that the real sort of a founder of Indian democracy. So the democratic revolution doesn't start with just the constitution; it goes back all the way to the Southborough Commission, and people generally try to look at the political sort of the features of the movement. But as you know, as an Ambedkar scholar, that the roots of democracy in India were sowed long time in the Round Table Conference, and even prior to that, the Simon Commission, and the way history is taught in India is problematic. So one day, if the real version of Indian history will come, people will understand that the democratic revolution goes back in the deep time, in the history of our country. So we are all very, very proud of you, and you are doing immense work, because this information has a bearing. As in the morning we were listening to a scholar that these ideas are not outside of the society.
Yeah.
So they are not, whatever new ideas emerge, they ultimately get fed back into the society, and it helps the movement. For example, the Indian media historians have been trying to project for a long time Baba Sahib Ambedkar as a very small leader, but actually he was one of the giants in the Indian history, and his influence was so much so that everybody has to take cognizance of him, and he was not at the mercy of Congress or any party of that time. He was a leader in his own right and with his own power. So I think the kind of work that you are doing is very interesting, and Pardeep will agree with me that such kind of a scholarship is very much needed, because this will also open a lot of doors to the outside world to develop the alliances, particularly with the similar oppressed communities throughout the world. So with this the scholarship that you are doing, the internationalization of the Dalit issue, I think one of the issues that is also needed to be looked at is the Ambedkarite connection with the Burakumin community, because in 1945 one of the leaders and the founder of the Burakumin Liberation Army came to India, and he had a long discussion with Baba Sahib Ambedkar, and he was very inspired with that. And also this Woodward, who wrote this very famous book called The Strange Law of Jim Crow, which Martin Luther King considered as the Bible of his Bible for struggle. And Woodward has written in his biography that he was influenced to write that book because he had met Baba Sahib Ambedkar. So I think
wow.
there is a very interesting sort of the communication. A lot of information has to be digged out, and you are like the archaeologist of Ambedkarite movement. Not like we are not going into deeper time. So it's very heartening to Pardeep for inviting our brother here.
Thank you.
And we will have a much bigger conversation on these issues, because there are a lot of areas still explored. I hand it over to Pardeep to offer the final words before we conclude.
Yeah, I just have to say, like, thank you. Really, it was really informative, and I enjoyed it, and I hope viewers also have enjoyed it. And thank you once again for coming. And if you
Yeah.
have any final words to say, or something you missed, or you want to add, or we misinterpreted, or something, anything, so yeah, it's up to you, and you have now time.
Well, just to say thank you once again for inviting me and for engaging with my work. And yeah, that's the only thing I could say. Yeah, sometimes when you write these things, you don't know if people are going to read it at all. But this is really nice, really nice, and I'm happy to have more conversations whenever you want. So thank you for your work, and thank you for all of the efforts that you make for the community. And yeah, thank you for sharing my work as well.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, thank you,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.